Dear people watching and listening, Assalamu alaikum. Kindly like and share this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel. Kindly support my channel by contributing to my Patreon account so that I can continue making such audiobooks for you. The Muslim Conquest of Persia by Lieutenant General A.I. Akram. This book tells in detail about the Arab conquest of Persia, also known as the Arab conquest of Iran, during the Rashidun Caliphate from 633 to 654 AD. This conquest brought the fall of the Sassanid Empire, which was in power for over 4 centuries, while rivaling its neighbor, the Eastern Roman Empire of Byzantine. Start of the last chapter. Chapter 22. The Last of the Sasanis. Yazdjurd stands as one of the most ill-fated monarchs of history. Born under an unlucky star, he was destined to live his life in hardship, to have responsibility thrust upon him for which he was never trained, to carry burdens too heavy for the broadest shoulders. He had to spend his youth in obscurity, surviving only by fading out of the public eye. A prince living in humble surroundings, a monarch dragged to the throne because there was no one else against his own wishes, and when the decline of the empire had become so steep that no man born of woman could save it. He saw the light of day when the empire was shaken by misfortune. He was placed upon the throne when the empire had begun to totter, and he was to survive long enough, as a fugitive and a man marked by defeat, to see its final disintegration. Even his birth was unwanted, and for this we go back 2 generations in history. Khosrow's Parvez sat upon the throne of Persia. This was the emperor who had built the fabulous palace of Shirin and created around it an earthly paradise. He lived more lavishly than any emperor before him. He was the one who had 3,000 women in his harem and owned 760 elephants, 8,500 horses, and 12,000 mules. Parvez had 18 children, the eldest of whom was a boy named Shahryar, born to his favorite wife, Shirin. As Shahryar grew out of adolescence, some astrologers came to the emperor and said, "One of your sons will have a son at whose hand this court will be destroyed, and this empire lost, and the mark of that boy will be some defect in his body." Parvez was deeply perturbed by this prediction. He sought to avoid having grandchildren by not permitting his sons any contact with the fair sex. He placed them under a kind of sexual embargo and denied them all access to women. The prince hardest hit by this ban was the eldest, Shahryar, who was a healthy young fellow and thought that the restriction was most unfair, considering that his father had 3,000 women of his own. He complained to his mother and demanded a woman, threatening to kill himself if his wish were not granted. Shirin quietly slipped a slave girl into his chamber, one who used to act as hairdresser. It is said that she was actually a girl of good birth, but Shirin, in a fit of anger, had sent her to live for some time with Berbers, with the result that she became known as the hairdresser. However, the young prince had his fun, and to Shirin's horror, the girl became pregnant. Knowing what the astrologer had said, and the degree to which the emperor feared their gloomy forecast, she hid the girl. In due course a baby boy was born, and was also concealed by Shirin. This boy was the Yazdurd of our history, a man whose detractors would sometimes refer to him as the son of the hairdresser. 5 years passed and the child remained undiscovered. Then one day, finding Pervez in a benevolent mood, Shirin asked him if it would not be nice to have a grandson to play with. The emperor agreed that it would, and Shirin promptly produced Yazdurd. The emperor was delighted with the boy and kept him in his own chamber and would play happily with him. Then one day, Pervez recalled the prediction of the astrologers. He at once underpressed the child and examined him carefully. There was some defect in the boy's hips, and as soon as the emperor discovered it, he knew that this was the boy the sages had warned him against. He lifted the boy and was about to dash him to the ground, when Shirin snatched him away and clung to him. She would not let him go and begged piteously for the boy's life, which at last Pervez granted, so long as he was sent far away and never appeared before him. The poor, frightened 5-year-old child was sent to Sistan. Pervez got over his fears of what the astrologers had said, because the culprit had been found and banished, and now he could have grandchildren. And he did. And 11 years after the banishment of the little prince, Pervez himself was overthrown by his son Shiruya, who cast his father into a dungeon, where later he was blinded and still later killed. Shiruya turned against all the male members of the house of Sasan, and in order not to have any rivals, had them killed with the exception of his own son Ardshir. When this massacre of the princes began, Yazdurd was moved to Persepolis, and his existence was kept a secret from Shiruya and his assassins. At Persepolis, Yazdurd lived in obscurity until 11 Hijri, that is 632 AD, when, in the absence of their princes who could be placed on the throne, he was discovered and crowned. He came to the throne utterly unprepared for the responsibilities of kingship, and was suddenly called upon to save the empire from falling apart. He was a fine young man of 21, with thick blue-black hair and beautiful teeth. He wore earrings. Yazdurd came to the throne in 11 Hijri, and soon after, Persia was struck by Khalid bin al-Walid, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, who raced like a tempest along the Euphrates, flattening every Persian army which stood in his path. The sword of Allah, as Khalid was called, took to the west bank of the Euphrates and raided deep into the Suwad. So roughly did he handle the Persians that by the end of 12 Hijri they had refused to fight him and had withdrawn into Ctesiphon and to the east side of the Tigris. Khalid's operations were a model in strategy and tactics, sticking to the fringes of the desert and drawing the Persians away from the well-watered Suwad. Rapid movement by forced marches to surprise and outmaneuver his enemies, full concentration of effort with his army of 18,000 lightly armed, fast-moving warriors against the Persians and Christian Arabs, who usually outnumbered him by 2 to 1. The violence of his assaults, often from an unexpected direction and at an unexpected time, his own personal victories in single combat over Persian champions attacking. It was a terrible experience for Persia, but Khalid was sent off to Syria by Caliph Abu Bakr, radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, and the Persians breathed easily again. The campaigns which followed the departure of Khalid from Iraq have been fully described in this book, Yazdur's part in these campaigns was to organize and launch his armies in the field with the advice of top generals like Rustam and Bahman. There was no flaw in his strategy, and Yazdur had considerable success in keeping up Persian spirits and strengthening the determination of his people to uphold the empire. The Persians believed in him, rested their hopes in their young sovereign, and there was nothing that he failed to do to justify their trust. If he did not load his armies in person, it was because he was not trained to do so, and under the circumstances it was wiser to let the veteran generals command the armies in battle. It was, after all, their job. Initially the Persians had some success, but at the bloody Battle of Qadisiyah, they were badly defeated and had to fall back upon Ctesiphon. The trend of military events established at Qadisiyah could not be reversed. One by one, Ctesiphon, Jalola, Qasr Shirin fell to the Muslims and Yazdud tasted, one after another, the bitter pills of defeat, retreating before the victorious enemy and, fugitive-like, seeking help at every next stage of his flight. But his resistance continued, and while many Persians in the Suwad abandoned hope and joined the Muslims, he did not. After the fall of Qasr Shirin, he came to Isfahan and then travelled widely in his empire, mustering forces and urging his subjects to stand fast against the peril from the desert. They still believed in him, and he still believed in them. He maintained Hormuzan in Khuzistan with supplies and reinforcements and gave that general all the backing that he needed. But Khuzistan too fell to the Muslims. Next came Nihawand, and in it the Persians put in everything they had. They hoped that by winning a decisive victory in this one battle they would re-establish the empire, restore its boundaries, and rid their land of the invaders. This battle would decide the fate of Persia and the fate of Yazdurd, and it did. Their fate was sealed. With fading hope, but still unwilling to acknowledge defeat, Yazdurd came to Isfahan. He had been ruling the empire for 10 years, a decade which in crisis and calamity was more than a lifetime. Few monarchs before him had had to carry such a staggering burden and face such a powerful, irresistible, dauntless enemy, an enemy who sought death as ardently as the Persians sought life. We do not know if Yazdur's hair turned grey, but it should have done, even if he was now only 31 years old. A few months later, as the Muslims began their advance to Isfahan, Yazdurd left the city and travelled to Rai. His departure did not have a good effect upon the Persians, and many of them began to lose hope of ever restoring the empire. Thus, when Abdullah bin Utban approached Isfahan, Persian resistance was not very stiff, and the governor surrendered the city while he could have fought on and prolonged the siege by many months. The fall of Isfahan, following close upon the heels of Nihawand, had a further depressing effect on Persian morale. The ranks of those who believed in the inevitability of Muslim conquest swelled, and signs of a change of loyalty became apparent. The first man to show this change was the governor of Rai, whose treatment of the emperor turned positively disrespectful. This was a cruel blow for Yazdud to suffer after all his misfortunes, and he left Rai with a few trusted followers and went to Persepolis. Here he stayed for over a year, doing his best to rule efficiently what remained of the empire, and to take measures against further attacks by the Muslims when they came. In this he had some success, for when the Muslims invaded Fars in 23 Hijri, Persian troops put a fairly stiff opposition. But Yazdurd left Persepolis on the approach of the Muslims and moved to Kirman. The governor of Kirman welcomed him, but when the Muslims continued their advance from Fars, this official also turned cool in his loyalty. One day when Yazdurd asked for money from the provincial treasury, the governor told him to go, and Yazdurd went, this time to Sistan. The Muslims followed and took Kirman. In Sistan it was the same story all over again. The Muslims came nearer, the Persians began to fear for themselves, and Yazdurd needed money. Nothing could be simpler than to get rid of the unwanted emperor. And the emperor, finding little support and seeing clear signs of treachery, took to the road once again. He went to Merv, the northeastern part of his empire. At Merv he stayed in peace for a time. He still had a good deal of the imperial treasure with him. Then Ahnaf bin Qais, having taken Herat, directed his army towards Merv, and Yazdurd, feeling like a hunted animal, whose pursuers were not relent, prepared to leave for Balkh. He told the citizens of Merv that he would join the Khakan of the Turks or go to China, but they tried to persuade him to stay and make peace with the Muslims, who were more to be trusted than the Turks or Chinese. He refused to stay, whereupon the people took his treasure away and drove him out of their town. Ahnaf bin Qais arrived soon after to receive the willing submission of the city. Yazdurd went on to Balkh and turned once again. He gathered an army from Farghana, and as Ahnaf came after him, faced him in battle. But he had no success in the field and was forced to retreat across the Oxus and take refuge in Farghana, where he lived for several years with the Khakan as a king without a kingdom. After Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu became caliph, and in the very first year of his caliphate, 24 Hijri, there was a revolt in Azerbaijan and Armenia, which was put down before it could get out of control. 3 years later, the Kurds rose in the region of the hills south of Kermanshah, but they too were quickly brought into line. In 28 Hijri, however, the situation became more serious for the Muslims as the Persians made desperate attempts to throw off the Muslim rule in the northeastern and southeastern provinces of the empire. At Persepolis, the Persians rose, defeated the Muslim garrison in action, and killed the Muslim commander. Kirman followed suit, and these two provinces for a time again established Persian rule. Yazdurd appeared in Fars soon after this, but could not stay long because Uthman radiallahu ta'ala anhu sent another army to suppress the rebellion, which it successfully did, and Yazdurd withdrew in haste to Kirman. In 29 Hijri, Khurasan and much of Tabristan revolted against the Muslims. Details of this uprising are not known, and the accounts of the early historians are not only sketchy, but also confusing. Anyway, the Caliph had to send another two armies to deal with the revolt, one to the north and the other to the south, and in 30 Hijri, the back of the resistance was broken and both regions again brought under Muslim rule. Yazdurd, who appears to have directed operations from Kirman, found that his fortunes were no better now than they had been during the past 20 years. Yazdurd was on the run again. He left Kirman with a body of 4,000 men, including 1,000 noble knights who had remained loyal to him and were led by Farrukhzad, brother of the late Rustam, and made for Merv, the citizens of which had driven him out 7 years before. It was now early 31 Hijri, that is late 651 AD, and he was fully determined to raise another army and continue his war against the Arabs who had not yet retaken Marv. The governor of Marv was a man named Mahawi. He was loyal enough to serve and support his master while the going was good, but not loyal enough to stand by him in his hour of need. A perfidious man, he began to prepare the people of the district, even before the arrival of Yazdurd, to turn against their emperor, but on his approach made a show of obedience and loyalty. Yazdurd entered Marv, unaware of the scheming nature of his governor, and wrote letters to the king of Farghana and the emperor of China, asking for their help against the Arabs. There was also a polite exchange of letters with Naizak Khan, the Khan of the Turks living in the province of Khurasan, who owed allegiance to the Persian emperor. At this moment, Naizak was the most powerful man in Khurasan. A month passed during which strong suspicions arose in Yazdurd's mind about Mahawi's integrity and honesty in administration and his loyalty as a subject. He thought to dismiss the man from his office and asked him to produce an account of all the revenue received by him. Upon this Mahawi, knowing that he had to act fast if he was to save himself, went into action. He wrote secretly to Naizak Tarkhan that Yazdurd was a defeated monarch and a fugitive, that he intended to harm both of them, that they should move against him jointly and overpower him, whereafter they could either kill him or take from him what they wished. Naizak, no more loyal than the governor of Merv, responded to this conspiratorial invitation by writing to Yazdurd and seeking the hand of his daughter. Yazdurd may have been a victim of misfortune, but he still had his Persian pride and was indignant at the insolence of a subject asking for the daughter of his sovereign. He told his secretary to write to Naizak that he was one of his slaves, and how dare he ask for the emperor's daughter. Upon receiving this rude reply, Naizak gathered an army of Turks. It was not a very large one, and marched against Merv. The news of this event reached Merv soon after, and Yazdurd ordered Mahawi to call out his troops, which the governor did, having no doubt in his mind that the Turks would win. With this army, which included the emperor's 4,000 loyal warriors, Yazdurd advanced to meet his rebellious Turkish subject. The two armies met at Jalindan, not far from Merv. Here a battle was fought between Yazdurd and Naizak Tarkhan, with Mahawi keeping up an appearance of fighting, but not actually doing so. Yazdurd's 4,000 loyal troops gave an excellent account of themselves and pressed hard against the Turks, who were pushed back. It soon became obvious that victory was about to fall into the emperor's lap, and this was something which Mahawi could not permit. At a critical moment in battle, the treacherous man took his own soldiers of Merv away from the emperor and went over to join the Turks. The defection of this sizable force turned the scales against Yazdurd. Naizak and Mahawi attacked fiercely, and the loyalists found themselves vastly outnumbered. The battle did not last long. Most of Yazdur's men were killed, and the emperor fled from the battlefield. He got to Merv, but the fickle inhabitants of the city, seeing his condition and sensing that he was a fugitive, refused to open their gates to him. Yazdur was all alone. He dismounted from his horse, which had been wounded in battle, and walked away on foot. He dragged his feet. There was nowhere for him to go. Yazdur was a child of misfortune. He appeared on the stage of history at the wrong time. He not only had to carry the burden of the sins of many predecessors, but also had to face the all-conquering thrust of the new faith of Islam, which moved like a vast tidal wave across much of the non-civilized world, a tidal wave which saved the world from itself, swept away its evil, and purified mankind. History, like the world, worships the rising sun. Yazdur was a setting sun. He has been compared with Darius III, the last of the Achaemenians, with whom the earlier Persian Empire collapsed before Alexander. But the comparison is not a fair one. Unlike Yazdur, Darius was born and brought up at court and trained to rule. Unlike Yazdur, he came to power during a period of greatness and strength, and had time to consolidate his position before being struck by a great conqueror. Unlike Yazdur, he had vast armies on call to throw into the field against the invader. In these respects, Yazdur had all the disadvantages, but unlike Darius, he fought on for a long time, 20 years, and went on fighting to the end. And in the end, all his labors wasted. Yazdur also suffered the cruel treachery of his own subjects, who not only abandoned their sovereign in his dark hour, but also came to destroy him. One is reminded of the lines of Hannah More Daniel. A crown? What is it? It is to bear the miseries of a people, to hear their murmurs, feel their discontents, and sink beneath a load of splendid gear. To have your best success ascribed to fortune, and fortune's failures all ascribed to you. It is to sit upon a joyless height, to every blast of changeless fate exposed, too high for hope, too great for happiness. Yazdur, abandoned by all and having abandoned all hope, walked the earth of Merv in the fading light. Soon it was dark. After wandering about 7 miles, he came upon a miller's house by the river Murghab. He entered the room which faced him as he approached the house. It was unoccupied. He threw himself on the floor and slept the sleep of the utterly exhausted. The following morning the miller entered the room and stared in astonishment at the strange visitor. He had never before seen such a splendidly dressed man. He asked the emperor if he was a man or a jinn. The emperor affirmed that he was a man and called for food. The miller brought food for his unknown guest. Another day and night passed. Then the miller asked for money with which to buy food. But Yazdur had no money. He offered his bewildered host his jewel-encrusted belt, but the miller declined the gift, saying that he would prefer 4 dirhams. Yazdur replied that he did not have 4 dirhams. Then, with a bitter laugh, he said, I used to be told that I would want to not have 4 dirhams. The next day Yazdur asked for a certain kind of bread, and the miller went to Merv to get it. There, in conversation with some soldiers, he mentioned his strange guest and described his appearance, and news of this at once spread in the city. Before long, it reached the ears of Mahavi, who had been searching for the fugitive emperor without success. The governor sent for the miller, and from his description of his guest, knew that he had found his prey. He at once ordered some officers to go with the miller to his house, kill the emperor, and bring his head. The high priest of Merv, who was present, protested strongly against this order and warned the governor that since in Persia religion was inseparable from the crown, such an act would be a sacrilege. Some others also joined the high priest in his objections, but Mahavi refused to listen to them and insisted that his evil design be carried out. The officers followed the miller and got to the mill. The 41-year-old Yazdurd pleaded for his life. He offered the assassins what treasures he still possessed: his crown, his belt, his bracelet, and his sword, but his pleas had no effect. They moved closer. He then asked them to send him to the Arabs, for they would not kill a fallen monarch. They strangled him with a bowstring. The body of the dead emperor was stripped of all its finery. His head was severed from the body, and the corpse was thrown into the Morghab. It flowed down the river until it hit a partially submerged log and stuck against it. A few Persian Christians from Ahwaz were visiting Marv and heard of the fate of Yazdurd. They and some local Christians, headed by the bishop of Marv, went to retrieve the emperor's body. They had a special regard for him because of his grandmother Shirin, who was a Christian and always showed kindness to the Christians. They took his body out of the river and buried him with honor in Marv, and over his grave they built a wooden structure to mark the last resting place of the last of the Sasanis. According to some versions, Yazdurd was killed by the miller who coveted his jewels, and later the Persians of Merv killed the miller and his family and destroyed his mill. It could be so. Most historians have described both versions and left the reader to take his choice. The Sasani Empire was crushed by the young giant of Islam, which arose in Arabia. The empire had lived a full life, marked with glory and power, and in its decline gave way to a new and stronger culture, which derived its strength from the divine word of the Quran and the example of Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the last of Allah's apostles. But while the Sasani Empire was destroyed by the sword of Islam, Persia herself was saved by the spirit of Islam and given a new and longer lease of life as a nation and empire. Before we go into this further, however, we must deal with an important misconception about Islam, a misconception arising from conquests such as those described in this volume and actively encouraged by the enemies of Allah, that Islam was spread by the sword. For centuries the world of Islam has heard this charge, and as proof has been told that Islam spread as its armies marched and conquered. The charge is, of course, untrue and unworthy of intellectual acceptance. But even some Muslims have begun to believe it, being unable to distinguish between the spread of the empire and the spread of the faith, two different things. The Muslim empire was certainly established by the sword, but the Muslim faith was not. It must be understood that all empires spread by the sword. There is no other way to establish an empire. A would-be conqueror does not walk up to the frontier of the land which he wishes to conquer and politely ask its people to submit so that he can have his empire. Empires are established with military might, assisted at times by guile and treachery. One glance at the blood-soaked history of man will prove this point, and the reader will not find a single instance in history of an empire spreading by love and peace. So how could the Muslim empire spread except by the sword? And yet it is to the everlasting credit of Islam that unlike all other empires of history, its armies marched not to conquer, but to convey the message, and this is particularly true of the early conquests of Islam. As illustrated several times in this book, the Muslims first made an offer of their faith to the Persians, and Muslim envoys gave a guarantee that if their faith were accepted, they would return to their own land and not come again except for trade. This was not done before nor ever again by any other army creating an empire. It took the early Muslims to set this standard and to keep their operations free of trickery and deceit. The next point to bear in mind is the distinction between the spread of the empire and the spread of the faith. According to Ibn Khaldun, a conquered people come to regard their conquerors as a superior nation by the very fact of their success, and tend to adopt the conqueror's ways as their own. The ways of Islam were superior to all ways, and this made the new faith even more acceptable to the conquered peoples. Not only were the early Muslim models of the perfect conqueror, but the light of Islam which shone upon the conquered nations made all other religious and cultural lamps appear dim in comparison. Thus the Persians and other peoples conquered by Islam embraced the new faith readily and willingly, and in it they found their salvation. Nearer our time we have seen European powers conquering vast areas of Asia and Africa. As a result of this colonial expansion, Western civilization spread over these continents. Yet we have never heard a European historian say that Western civilization was spread by the sword. It would indeed be absurd to say that it was, though not more absurd than to say that Islam was spread by the sword. Islam offered complete equality and full justice to all conquered peoples, and created a degree of equality between conqueror and conquered which never existed before. The much maligned system of the jizya, which was a tax paid by non-Muslims only, was actually a concession in that it absolved the non-Muslim from military service. In other words, he was permitted to buy himself out of a heavy responsibility at a nominal price. Where the non-Muslim preferred not to pay the tax and serve in the army, he was inevitably petted to do so, and many Christians and Zoroastrians served in the Muslim armies, under Muslim commanders, and took the same share of the spoils as Muslim soldiers. The generous and humane treatment of the conquered peoples by the Muslims stemmed not only from the teachings of the Quran, but also from the example of the Holy Prophet, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, who would instruct his generals. Fight in the name of Allah, fight but do not exceed the bounds, and do not be treacherous, and do not mutilate, and do not kill women and children, and do not kill the inhabitants of monasteries. The sword of Islam knocked Persia down. The spirit of Islam picked Persia up and gave her the shot in the arm which she needed. The old man became a youth again, finding new life in Islam and discovering new horizons. But for Islam, Persia today may have been a small, insignificant country like Greece or Austria or Mongolia, reminding the world of its vanished imperial glory. Empires have their time, and when that time is over, they vanish forever. They can live again in greatness only as a new people with a new culture, and this is how Persia gained a new life. She assimilated Islam, embellished its culture with beauty, and made it part of her own heritage. The Persian intellect, never fully manifested before Islam, found in Islam the right motive power and in Arabic the right vehicle of expression. The combination of the three was stupendous. While Persian poets and mystics continued to use Persian, which itself was strengthened by Arabic, their thinkers, philosophers, and scientists broke out in Arabic and gave the world the finest literature of the age. Avicenna, al-Biruni, al-Khwarizmi, al-Ghazali, al-Razi, and a host of others bestrode the world of thought like Colossi and laid the foundations of modern science and philosophy. A great deal of what is now known as Muslim literature arose from Muslim Persia. As a nation and a political entity, also the Persians rose again, first as small kingdoms and then as an empire. Islam gave them the strength and resilience to withstand the shock of such cataclysms as the invasions of Genghis Khan and Timur, and to retain their identity as a people. After Timur, the empire rose again under the Safavids, who re-established the imperial traditions of Persia. With varying fortunes, after some glorious rises and some pitiful falls, the imperial destiny of Persia finally manifested itself in the Pahlavi dynasty, which appeared after the First World War and which now rules Persia. Today one sees Persia as a country at once old and young, old because it carries with it the presence of its grand past, stretching back to the heroic age of Persia, and young because it vibrates with the spirit and vigor of youth. A nation proud of its path, conscious of its strength, and confident of its future as under its brilliant monarch, it marches on to overtake the world. The most distinctive quality of Persia today, which her history emphasizes and which strikes the visitor with force, is beauty. The beauty of her great cities, full of character and style, towering monuments to the glory and grandeur which have marked Iran for 25 centuries of history. The beauty of her broad valleys flanked by rugged mountains, which are all the more majestic when they are bare of trees. The fertile earth of these valleys, now red, now brown, now light brown, the color seeming to change as the moving sun paints the landscape in gentle hues. The beauty of her way of life, the perfect manners, the warm greetings and affectionate courtesy, the honey-sweet language which sings as it goes, and in which even military words of command remind one of Hafiz, the loving nature of the people. The beauty of her arts and crafts, the silver work and miniatures of Isfahan, the inlays of Shiraz, the pottery of Hamadan, the peerless carpets of so many places, too many to mention, all reflecting the delicate sensibilities of the Iranian people and challenging the world to match them. The beauty of a fascinating culture, an amalgam of literature, sculpture, song, and dance spanning 25 centuries, combining the grandeur of the past with the sparkling gaiety of the present. From the proud bas reliefs of the early Achaemenians to the modern, vibrant singing of the incomparable Gogos. The beauty of her people, the fine, stalwart, soldierly men, the pretty, pink-cheeked, bright-faced children, the lovely women who enhance with modern beauty techniques what is already the finest example of Aryan womanhood, while retaining the saltiness of the Oriental and the alluring charm of the Persian peri, the effect of their rich coloring heightened by their dark, deep eyes. This was the land of beauty which Islam conquered and made its own. May it remain so till the end of time. End of chapter 22. End of the book The Muslim Conquest of Persia by Lieutenant General A. I. Akram.